All right, so now we're on our road, our journey to the mountain. We're in the middle of the week, the middle of the weeks. The sermon today is called The Midst of the Weeks. Now, I know I've done a sermon in the past about the midst of the week, and we know that talking about Jesus Christ being crucified in the middle of the week. But this sermon is dealing with the midst of weeks. So as I was preparing the newsletter so we can fold after services today, and I was in the other room, Edgar was telling me, he said the devil jumped all over him this week, and he was in the back, he's getting cramps while he was sitting there, and I said, you know, it's kind of funny that right now, right in the middle of weeks, a lot of things have happened. I mean, my phone's been burning up with problems around the country, and people asking for prayers and emails, and you name it. A lot of things going on out there. But you know, here's what we normally do, and I'm going to show you this in just a second. We finish Passover, and our mind runs to Pentecost, yeah, Pentecost. But you know, there's a period of time between now and Pentecost. And so when we look at God's plan, we're looking at it this way, this. But that isn't the way God tells the story of the Israelites. And I want to talk about that today. So when we consider the Exodus and the children of Israel, we look at their stories in little boxes. In other words, this happened, this happened, this happened. For example, the departure of Egypt. We'll go back to the departure of Egypt. We'll talk about the plagues, the seas opening. We talk about the sea crossing as an event. We talk about reaching the mount and it giving them of the 10 Commandments. But you know, that's not the way God tells the story. And so because we don't follow the path that God gave us the story, we miss what's going on in the middle. And so I began to think about it this week with all these occurrences going on. How many people actually realized we're in the middle of the weeks? In other words, our mind is focused here and focused here rather than here. And this is where the children of Israel got in trouble. Here, in the midst of weeks. And so often in our journeys to the mountain, we look down the road, but we're not looking at today to get down the road. So we find ourselves in trouble. That's like my phone. The phone's ringing. Attitudes are bad. People and I'm telling you, some of the attitudes were really bad. You know, some were good, some were humbled. So, you know, a lot of pain, a lot of suffering. But God tells the story as journeys rather than pieces. It's through those journeys that we find the meaning that He's left for us. So I'm going to take a piece of the journey today and try to put it together between the Pentecost and the Passover we just came through. The journey to reach God's mountain in Exodus 3. All right, this is the journey where God starts with. Now, some of this, if you've been following the Exodus series that we did a couple years ago, and if you haven't, you really ought to go back. You can get it online, you can download it, or if you got the DVDs from 2 years ago, pull them out. This is the time to pull them out. I'm using a couple of those sermons, just a couple pieces out of it, to pull together another piece of the puzzle today. So when you get this sermon, and actually it's going to be on a card that we're offering it on a card, so you can get the DVD, you can put it with your Exodus series, because this is another piece of the puzzle. It's like it just never ends, the amount of information that God keeps sharing. So Exodus 3, verse 7. So the Lord said, I have surely seen the oppressions of my people who are in Egypt. They have heard the cry, and we've heard the cry because of their taskmasters, and I know their sorrows, so I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians. Come now, therefore, and this is verse 10 now, we jumped a couple verses. Come now, therefore, and I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. And so he said, I will certainly be with you, and this shall be a sign that I have sent you, that when you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. All right, so here's the point. You're coming down, he says. God has sent me down to get you, to bring you back to where I came from. So he's starting with the mountain. He's left the mountain. He's come down. He gathers the children of Israel. He walks them through and says, bring them back to the mountain. All right, so that's not complicated. We all understand. So now, the journey is getting there. All right, the journey is getting there. Just like with you and I. God says He'll never leave or forsake us, right? God never left them or forsook them. All the way to the mountain. But they didn't make it, most of them. So there's some examples that we need to pick up and understand why he's left them for us. Somewhere in the midst of their journey, the Israelites came to a crossroad. They were tired, they were thirsty, they were hungry, and they began to complain and rebel against the Eternal, and the account is found in Exodus 16. Now, this is just one of those times. They did that several times. Finally, they reached the point, and God says, I'm sick of you. That's it. You want to die in the wilderness? You're going to go die in the wilderness. I want to picture this one here because, see, God's reaction is different this time. When they complained, God gave them food, and God gave them water, and God gave them something else that came in this chapter. I'm going to take the first 4 verses, and this is one of those chapters where you got to tear apart a verse to know the background to understand what's coming after that. So I'm going to spend a lot of my time in the beginning of the sermon here to build the background, because if you don't know the background for Exodus 16, verse 1, you miss the story, and you miss why God's left it for us. So now we're going to take it in 2 parts. We're going to talk about the nuts and bolts of the information, and then we're going to pull in the spiritual significance for it at the end. All right, so here's 16, verse 1. So they journeyed for Elam, and all the congregation of the children of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elam and Sinai, on the 15th day of the 2nd month after they departed from the land of Egypt. So they've been out a month. We know the scripture, God says they came out on the 15th day of the 1st month by night. Now, a month has gone by. It's the 15th day of the 2nd month. And the whole congregation of the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the children of Israel said to them, Oh, that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the pots of meat, and we ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. Now that's a tough reaction. That's a really tough reaction. You know, I thought about that with the church, though, over the last few years. And how many people have taken it out on God when the church went sour, or they had a corrupt minister, or corrupt leadership, or there was abuse? And they say, if that's the way it is, I don't want nothing to do with God. And I always wondered, why do they take it out on God if there's somebody else that's got a problem? You think about that with the churches continually split. You have churches that are split. So congregations that are sitting like you and I are here, meeting in peace and harmony, because headquarters somewhere splits. Now the congregation don't talk to one another because they got to pick a side. When just the week before, they loved one another. I never understood all of that. In fact, one of the times in the splits, I was so mad, I gave a sermon and said, from now on, when there's a split, you all go decide what you're going to do and tell us when you're finished, because we're not moving. It was so pitiful when you think about all that. So here the children of Israel are blaming God, who just saved them from Egypt 1 month after they come out. And the Lord said, Behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you. All right, so there's the first 4 verses, and that's what we want to work on. So here's the question I couldn't answer for a lot of years. We're looking at the 2nd month, 15th day of the month, and God's going to begin giving them manna. Somewhere in this chapter, God introduces the Sabbath to them, right? So here's my question. Why did God wait this long to give them the Sabbath? Don't tell us. It really doesn't say, did it? So I couldn't answer the question until this week. And I'm going to share that with you today. So if you think you got your answer, write it down right quick. Here, tell me why. Then they asked, how long was it before God introduced the Sabbath when they came out? I asked somebody that last night, and he sent me back, he said, 30 days. I said, nope, it was 37 days. Because on this day, even though it was a Sabbath day, God didn't tell them it was a Sabbath day. He began giving them bread the next day for 7 days, and he introduced the Sabbath the following week. So it was 37 days for the Sabbath. Now, we know the Sabbath's critical. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. So God, who gave the commandment to keep it holy, that it was established from Genesis, why did he wait to tell them about the Sabbath? So that perplexed me. It's found in this chapter 16. Okay, you ready? Let's go see what's in the chapter. Okay, Exodus 16, which is a powerhouse chapter. This chapter gives us the giving of manna. He gives us where he's establishing the Sabbath with the brethren, and it answers two questions. First one is, why did God wait 4 weeks to introduce the Sabbath? It was 5 weeks before they actually partook of it. So he began to introduce what he was going to do on the Sabbath day without telling him it was a Sabbath. The introduction came 4 weeks on the 15th day. And second is, why did God tie the Sabbath to the introduction of manna? So if you can answer the first one, the second one would be easy. But I could never answer the first one. All right, so now, let's go through Exodus 16, verse 1. So they journeyed from Elim, and all the congregation of the children of Israel came into the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they departed out of Egypt. Now let's take the verse and let's look at it. Elim, from Elim. So what are we looking at? What does Elim represent? Elim was Israel's 8th stop. All right, Israel stopped. It was the 8th day that they stopped. Is that important? Absolutely, if you understand the journey. If you're just looking at it from one point to the other, it makes no difference. But if you don't understand the journey, then you miss the significance. All right, so Elim was Israel's 8th day. It was the first day after leaving Egypt. Look what Exodus 15:22 says. So Moses brought Israel from the sea, then they went out into the wilderness of Shur, and they went 3 days into the wilderness and found no water, and there they came to Marah, and they could not drink the waters of Marah because they were bitter. Now, what are we looking at here? We know that Elim was the 8th day, Marah was the 7th day. It was the last stop. It was right on the outskirts of Egypt. It's right there, right by the outskirts of Egypt. Marah was the 7th day of Israel's journey, 3 days from the sea. The waters start off bitter until Israel, remember, throws in a tree and the water becomes sweet. Now, this is honestly telling you a story. This is like a parable that Jesus would be given to the New Testament and his disciples as he tells the story, and you got to figure out who the players are and why. So now, if we look at what's going on here, I'm going to bring this chart up, and this chart I'm going to bring in later, and I'll explain the chart as we go through the chart. But I need to give it to you here in case you're new and you don't understand all the things we've been talking about over the last couple of years. This chart shows us that the 7,000 years that God gives man and the 7 days of the Israelites was to come out of Egypt and the crossing in the sea. And you get the 7,000 years, a day is 1,000 years, as Peter talks about. So why is this important? Is because the 7th stop is the millennium. It's the 7,000th year. Remember, Hebrews says there remains therefore a rest. All right, just talking about the Sabbath, there remains a Sabbath, a holy day rest. That's the 7,000th year. Why is that important? Because it ties in tomorrow. At the beginning of the millennium, there are going to be bodies thrown everywhere. There's going to be such wastelands and people who are dead. And having all of this begin, it's like the bitter waters. Starting the millennium is not going to be pretty. But as Jesus Christ comes in and he throws himself into the mix, it begins to get sweeter as time goes on during that 1,000 years. So by the end, you have this land that's becoming wholesome and rich. That is the 7th day and the 7th stop, and that is Marah, and that's why it starts out bitter and it turns sweet. It's because of the millennial reign. So you see now, as we're walking through this, if you keep that concept and you go from Genesis 12 all the way through to Exodus 12 to Exodus 20, you begin to pick the story up, and the story tells us what's going on in God's plan of salvation. All right, so now, then it goes to Exodus 15, verse 27, just 5 verses later. It says, they leave Marah and they come to Elim, where there were 12 wells of water and 70 palm trees so that they camped by the waters. What are we looking at? Now we're understanding, we're looking at the plan of God. So what happens after the millennium? All right. We have Elim's 8th stop is for the Israelites, 12 wells, 70 palm trees. It gives you the type around the throne of God. You have the 12 thrones, you have the elders, you have the 70 palm trees, the 70 elders. You have all of this greatness, which talks about the Feast of Tabernacles, the last great day that says the great day of the feast. Why? Because it's beginning to prepare for the new heaven and the new earth. So you have all this majesty coming around the 8th day, which follows the millennial reign. You have the second resurrection. You have that short period, probably 100 years as best we can determine. So there you have the 8th day, Elam, talking about the plan. Now, let's look at the same verse now. Let's add some more to the same verse. Elam journeyed from, Elam to Sinai. So now we know that God says they're going to leave Elam, which was the 8th stop, going all the way to Sinai, and that is at the foot of the mountain in Exodus 20 and Exodus 19. So the first point we see is that God has brought the children of Israel on a route that fulfills Exodus 3 that we talked about from the beginning. He says, go down, remember, get the children of Israel and bring them back here to the mountain. So now we're looking at Exodus 16 verse 1 is literally giving us a route that God's telling them to bring them. All right, so where are you leaving? You're leaving the throne of God, the 12 thrones, the 70 elders. Go down. You're going to come through a wilderness and bring them back to Sinai, which pictures the mount, the throne of God. So you getting it? See it? We're still in verse 1. So you need to know the background to understand what's going on. All right, so let's keep working on verse 1. So Moses was sent from the mount of God to bring them back to the mount of God. So they sent from, in spiritual principle, the throne of God, bringing them back to, that's right, the throne of God. That's what you're looking at, from Elam to Sinai. God's to go down and bring them back to me, is what God's saying. So now, here's another point. The second point, same verse. The second point is God is giving us is this. The wilderness of Sinai is between Elam and Sinai. So we know that the wilderness of sin between Elam and Sinai, we know the location, and we know the time of the complaining of the children of Israel. It's right. Let me show you. The wilderness of sin is between Elam and Sinai. It's interesting that God calls it that, right? So between the throne and going back to the throne, what does God call this period? The wilderness of sin. All right, so understanding the wilderness of sin begins to understand, why did he wait until the 4th week to give us the Sabbath day? All right, so I'm throwing that out there. All right, so now, on the 15th day of the 2nd month after they departed out of Egypt. Now, I'm going a little slow with this so you can keep up with it, but you can get the DVD. When you get it, just stop it and write down and make your notes. Now, I don't know about you. I love this kind of stuff. I have learned more in the spiritual principles of God by going through this than you can ever imagine. So if it's boring to you, I'll try to do a better job because I don't find it boring at all. I find it really, really exciting because all these pieces of a puzzle that God's buried in his Bible begins to come out. Because everything I'm telling you now, I'm still in the same verse. So, wow, this is pretty good stuff. And I talk like that when I'm feeling like, boy, this is pretty cool. I'd be sitting at my desk and I'm laughing and giggling and I start talking to myself. My wife comes in thinking I'm a crazy man. You know, and I probably am, but it's exciting. I said, well, you're not going to believe this. Come see this. You know, it's like the comedian go, ooh, 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 come here. All right, so now watch what happens here. The 15th day of the 2nd month. So now the wilderness of sin between Elam and Sinai, let's put it into a graph where we can see it. So now the wilderness of sin is between what? Elam and Sinai. How long does that take? In God's plan, it takes 7,000 years. In the plan on earth, what are we looking at? On the 15th day of the 2nd month after they departed out of Egypt. The timing is in the 2nd month. Now, when is the timing in the Feast of Weeks? Why is that important here? All right, so let's go through that now. So now, what I've done here now is I went back into my notes, and this is how you build line upon line, in the precept upon precept. So I went back into the Exodus series, and you can go back and you get yours out. This is chapter 7 in the Exodus series, and it's called the Reestablishment of Time. So now this understanding the principle, I'm going to go through this real quick. It going to tell us where we're at on the 15th day of the second month. The wilderness of sin, let's put it back up one more time, between Elim and Sinai on the 15th day of the second month after they departed out of Egypt. So now here we have, so I'm going to be in this four corner over here, the 15th day of the second month. Now in the past we've already put the calendar together, so what I'm going to do here to show you where we're at, is that the children of Israel are grumbling to God on this day, which is actually a Sabbath day. But God doesn't tell them, you selfish, hypocritical people, don't you understand that this is the Sabbath and what I've done for you? God doesn't take that approach. He does something different here. He says, go tell them I'm going to bring them food, and tomorrow morning they're going to have bread. I'm going to rain bread from heaven, God says. All right, so now let's go through the chart. So now I'm going to work it backwards from the 15th to show you that this is actually in duality, the plan of God that matches the time of Christ to the time that he used the children of Israel. Now, when you think about this now, God put this together with all the orbits, the celestial bodies, the moons, the calendar, everything. Who knows how many eons ago when he laid it all out to set this time. When he told Abraham, he says, and you're going to go into captivity, and you're going to come out about 400 years later, and God says 430 years to the self-same day, that this event took place, and it found precisely to the minute of the time of Christ's day. So now we go back ways. We're counting the time back, 8, 7, 6, goes all the way through to the beginning of the month. Now we know the Hebrew month is 30 days or 29 days and so many hours. So now we go back into the first month. So you see the first month on the 30th day. Let's continue to count backways now to show you how the calendar lines up with the time of Christ. So it's going all the way back, 16, 15, 14. 14 actually falls in the middle of the week at the time of the departure of the children of Israel. Perfectly aligned to the time of Christ. So then and when we went through this chapter in the reestablishment of time, we went ahead and we moved it all the way through back to the first. Now this is why the people in the Protestant society and the Catholics today have no clue of the duality of this event. It's because of this. Exodus 12 verse 1 says, this is the beginning of months. It is the first month of the year. They throw in an assumption that it is also the first day of the week, the first day of the month. But remember now, God's calendar began with Abraham and continued. God never lost time. Just because they went into captivity, the calendar didn't stop. God didn't go back and say, oh, I got to go back and recalculate everything again. It continues. So here we see the first day of the month begins, Exodus 12:1, actually began on a Thursday of that year. And that's why the world misses it. Because you can go through some of the concordances, and they'll tell you the first day of the month was on a Sunday because it's the first day of the week. That isn't the plan of God. So now if we show you that, then look what else lines up. The 10th. Remember what did they do on the 10th? You had to choose the lamb. Jesus Christ was the lamb. They chose him, John 12, on the 10th day of the month. Christ was chosen. Lines up perfectly. What else lines up perfectly? The holy days on a Thursday and a Wednesday of that week. There's one more thing that's very important to our account that lines up that week is the wave sheath. On the morrow after the Sabbath inside the days of unleavened bread and the holy days. All right, so now we got the calendar built to begin to tell us, working our way through back to chapter 16 verse 1. So from the wave sheath to the Sabbath is the first week. The Feast of Weeks is how many? 7 weeks. Even unto the morrow after the 7th Sabbath, right? 7 weeks, 7 Sabbaths to the morrow after the Sabbath. So now let's go through and see what we have here. That's the first Sabbath. You have the second Sabbath, the third Sabbath, The 15th day of the second month is literally the fourth Sabbath of the 7 weeks of the Feast of Weeks. Why is that important? Because it is dead center of the 7 weeks. You have 3 weeks, the fourth, and 3 weeks. The dead center. It is the midst of weeks. Now, if I'm not mistaken, I believe, if we look at a calendar, I didn't look at this today, but I think today is the midst of weeks, isn't it? I think we are in the midst of weeks today. So it's interesting that God helped reveal some of this information for this week. On this day, it was the Exodus 16 period for us today. All right, so now going on. 15th day of the second month is exactly the midst of weeks. Even if we're not, I mean, I could be wrong on that. I'm going to have to go back and check that out for sure. On the charts, all right, on the charts we're seeing here, I brought one more in just now. This is from chapter 8. This is bringing in the third month because it's going to tie into our story today. So here's the third month. It's found in Exodus 19, Mount Sinai. They go to Mount Sinai, and they're going to have Pentecost and the giving of the Spirit in the New Testament. So let's put our Sabbaths up there again. So there's the wave sheath. So now we begin putting up our Sabbaths again. There's the fourth we are today, the fifth, sixth, and then the 7th week. So the 7 weeks for the children of Israel walks them through week by week till they will come to the morrow after the 7th Sabbath, which takes them to Mount Sinai. So here we have from Elim to Sinai, we have in the period of time through the wilderness of sin, bringing them to God. 50 days. Pentecost says 50 days. Now, here's what I want to bring in here. I'm going to show you this later, but I'll bring it up here for a question. This is an interesting week. Because here you see they're not in the wilderness of sin anymore. Exodus 19 will tell us that. So we're going to come back to that in just a minute. I wanted to mention that while we're there when we come back to the story. Because there's pieces of the story, you just got to pull them all together. So now here comes let's put the time in, and let's start putting some of these pieces together and watch how this all fits, just like a glove. The 7,000 years for mankind. A day is 1,000 years. We have that. All right, so now we know that we covered the 7,000th year is going to be the millennial reign, which is the Sabbath reign. So now we have the 7 days of unleavened bread, which is the type of the 7,000 years. The 7 days pictures us living in sin, putting out sin and taking in the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. Remember, that's what God's introducing here, bread, in this chapter. What else do we have? We have in 7 weeks to Mount Sinai. So again, you have years, you have the days, and you have the weeks, all pointing to the same thing, all telling the same story with a different perspective. All right, so what else do we have? We have between the 7th and the 8th day, you have the morrow after the Sabbath, which is the 50th day, and which is like the Feast of Tabernacles. Then you have the last great day, or the 8th day. You have Pentecost, which is the 7 weeks plus a day, which brings us to 50. So here we have, just like with the Jubilee, you have the 49th year, and you have the 49 of the weeks. You have the Sabbath, which is the millennial reign. And Hebrews 4:9 says, there remains, therefore, a Sabbath, a day of rest. So that makes sense. All right, I'm just going to keep putting this real smooth, real soft, to put it all together. So what else do you have? You have Pentecost being the 50th. Also, you have the 8th day of the feast. So all of these events are all lining up. They're all telling you the same thing. They're all pointing to the same thing. All right. What else do we have? We have the midst of the weeks. We have the midst of the week. We know for a fact that Jesus Christ was crucified in the middle of the week. What else do we have? We're seeing every single thing God gave. Weeks, days, years, millennia. Everything centering on the midst or in the middle. So what is God showing us? That everything in God's plan of salvation centers on the midst of the week. In other words, everything centers upon Jesus Christ. This whole creation, this entire plan, every story you read that's in the Bible, it all comes back to one point: the middle of the week. So now, the last one I'm going to put here. It also took them 7 days to leave Egypt, to cross the sea, and it was in the middle of the 7 days coming out of Egypt. That is the time that pictures that Jesus Christ came, overcame Satan, and opened the door for you and I. And I'll show you how that ties in just a few minutes. So now, here's the chart. Exodus 19, verse 1. In the 3rd month, after the children of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on the same day they came to the wilderness of Sinai now. They're no longer in the wilderness of sin. On the first day of this month, why did I highlight it a few minutes ago? Because now they have the Sabbath rest, the 7th week, the millennial reign, that the soon coming Father, the new heaven and the new earth, is in sight. But they're still in that period, what God calls here the wilderness of Sinai. They're not there yet, but they're almost. And this is what Jesus Christ is doing. What is he doing in that 1,000 years? His ministry is that of the restoration. So he's putting it all back together so that when the Father comes in a new heaven and a new earth, that 8th day, the 50th, the Pentecost, it all pictures the perfection coming back. So here we have the midst of the weeks, putting it all together. You have the Sabbath day. Oops, and I went too fast there. So there we have the Sabbath day on the last of the 7 weeks, all lined up together. Okay. Now let's go through the story now. And now we're going to begin putting all the nuts and bolts to the spiritual significance of why this is important to answer the question. All right, so 2. The whole congregation of the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the Lord and the children of Israel said to them, "Oh, that we had died by the hand in Egypt, that we sat by the pots of meat, and we ate bread to the full. For you have brought us into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." And then the Lord said to Moses, "Behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you." I said, wow, what a merciful thing to do. In the middle of their grumbling, instead of God chewing them out, he has mercy on them this time. God knew that without Christ coming, there was no hope for them. In other words, he could get mad at them, but until the time came that Jesus Christ provided the way, there was no hope for these children. There was no way they were going to make it. So what God says, okay, I'm going to send you manna from heaven. Look what John 6:32 says. Then Jesus said to them, "Most assuredly, I say to you, Moses did not give you bread from heaven." Wait a minute, ain't that what we just read? That's what we just read. So what Exodus 16 is telling us, it's not about the manna. It's about the timing of the coming of the Lord. And when is that? The 4th week, the middle of the 7,000-year period. The time when God's going to bring us down manna from heaven. Jesus says, Moses didn't give you that bread from heaven, but my Father gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. Exodus 16 is a prophecy of the time of the coming of the Lord. Is that Jesus Christ is the bread of life. And this is when he's going to come. That's what we're looking at here in Exodus 16. So now we have the midst of the weeks. God's telling us, what are we going to get in the midst of the weeks? The manna from heaven. Why did God wait 4 weeks to begin to introduce them to Sabbath? Because it was the period that was going to tell us that the Sabbath day will rest on Jesus Christ. He is Lord of the Sabbath. Why is it tied into manna? Because he is the manna. He's the bread of life. So what God chose to do, rather than just introduce a Sabbath, he tied it in to the timing of the prophecy of the return of the first coming of Jesus Christ in the middle of the 7,000 years, at the end of the 4,000-year period. That's what we're looking at, and that's why he waited, because it was a time pointing to Jesus Christ coming to this earth for the salvation of mankind. Before that, mankind had no hope. I mean, God could have got mad at them, but there was no reason to, because there was no way they were going to make it. But after this, while they had food, while they had water, and they still grumbled, God held them accountable. Now, that means a lot to you and I. Why? Because you and I know different. And you don't have a right to grumble anymore. When you read in Deuteronomy where God says, Moses, y'all lack nothing. Go tell the children when they walk through that wilderness. When I read that the first time, that really sunk into my head, when the children of Israel thinking about all they went through in that wilderness and the difficulties they had, and God says, you lack nothing. And I think about all the things we have today and what's coming. I said, wow, we're going to have a rude awakening before Christ returns. If they had everything, and I'm looking at what we've got in our ice boxes, our homes, our feet propped up watching TV and air conditioning, and they had everything. I think, whoa, man, this could get really ugly before Christ comes back. All right, so here, now going on. So here's the chapter I had at the beginning with the two questions. So the two questions were this. Why did he wait 4 weeks? And why did he tie it to manna? Well, we just answered that. Because it pictured the return of Jesus. I keep saying return. It pictures the coming of Jesus Christ, the salvation for mankind, and it tied in to partaking of him, the bread of life. So there we had 632. He says, for the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven, which is Jesus Christ. And what we just read, 634, they said, Lord, give us this bread. And Jesus said that I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall never hunger, but he who believes in me shall never thirst. So in other words, when God gave him that manna, he said from that time on, you should never be hungry and you should never thirst. But they did, and they grumbled over and over again. Now, let's look at our march to the mountain and tie in from everything that we know from the example so far that we have left to see what God has for us today. Exodus 20, and I put the little graph together so you can see what God was talking about in Exodus 20, verse 18. So now all the people witnessed the thunderings and the lightning flashes and the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking. And when the people saw it, they trembled and they stood afar off. And Moses said to the people, do not fear, for that God has come to test you, and that his fear may be before you, that you may not sin. Same way with you and I. God gives us information and gives us understanding and insight to try us whether we're going to walk in his way or not. I don't know if you knew this or not, but if God shows you some truth and you don't obey it and follow it, do you know your learning curve stops? It stops. You may not think it does, but why would God keep giving you more new truth if you're not going to act upon what you've already been given? There is a reverse of God says he'll not give you more than you can handle. If you can't handle the truth, it sounds like that phrase, I never planned on saying that, you can't handle the truth. Remember that movie? If you can't handle the truth, he's not going to keep giving you more, because he's not going to give you more than you can handle. Same way with problems, he says you're not going to give you more than you can handle. We always think about it that way. But the same way with truth. If you don't obey, why would God give you more? Acts 2 ties in to Exodus 20. Then the day of Pentecost had fully come. They were together with one accord in one place, and suddenly there came a sound from heaven as a mighty rushing wind. And it filled the whole house as they were sitting, and there appeared divided tongues as fire that one sat upon each of them. So now what God has done now, he's taken the children of Israel, give us the example. We walk through step by step, brings us to the mountain. You got the fire, the thunderings, the lightnings, and all this going on. And in the New Testament, it's going on the same way, except it's going on personally. Where the clothes were set on each person. It went inside the house instead of on a mountain. So what are we looking at there? We're looking at this mighty, the rushing wind filling in the whole house. It's like This is really important. It's as if a door was suddenly opened. As if a door was suddenly opened in a vacuum. It's like the poor lady who died on that plane this week. When the window broke and you have the pressure differentials, like sucked her out of the plane just about and wound up killing her. Well, it's almost like this pressure change. It's so that suddenly as if the door was open or a jar whose lid was removed. You ever notice when you open up a jar, you hear, and you hear that suction of the wind? Well, that's what's going on here. Because literally, that is what happened. A door was opened. So now let's talk about that. A door was opened and the lid was removed and the pressure had to be equalized. And so what God was doing is he was introducing his spirit into this world. And it was coming in individually, whereas before it was on the mountaintop. Now God's bringing it to each individual, and it has to like repressurize your system, your body, because we're filled with the wilderness of sin. So the period between our birth till we meet to the kingdom is our wilderness walk. And inside that wilderness, the Spirit has to come in and remove the sin. And so you have this mighty rushing winds going through your mind and your body, and God's equalizing you to be like him. And that's what God's showing them at the day of Pentecost. So now let's look at that number, the Hebrew word for number 4. It was the fourth week. It was the fourth day in the week, all right, going in. Means door. In Hebrew, it's door. I put it up there, dalet, means the door. Literally, at the book, in Acts, in the book of Acts chapter 2, literally Jesus Christ, the dalet, the door, opens the door, the wind begins to rush in and fill the souls with God's Spirit. And you know, you can feel that in this lifetime. Have you ever felt so close to God that all of a sudden you just feel like you're going to burst? Like there's this burning sensation inside of you? You'll read something, God will give you understanding, all of a sudden your body's filled with chills. Well, that's that mighty rushing wind just rushing into your body, God giving you his Spirit. Don't take that lightly. If you abuse that, it goes right back out again. And at some point, God's going to hold you accountable, just like the children of Israel. He reached the point, he says, I'm finished with them. He tells Moses, he says, I'm going to destroy them all, Moses. I'm going to start over with you. Eventually, only 2 of those people, 20 years and old, made it into the promised land. What a horrible story. So God left us all that. So he doesn't want us to look at the story as a piece here and a piece there. He needs you to understand it. That's a journey because it's your journey. And you're no different than them. I'm no different than them. This journey is bringing us to what? Through the door, through Jesus Christ. Look at John 10, verse 7. It says, Jesus said to them again, most assuredly I say to you that I am the door of the sheep. He opens the door, the wind just rushes in and fills your spirit and your soul and your might. Why? Because it's created this void, just like in a jar. What's the void? He's removed all your sins. Now you have a fresh, clean temple. And when he opens that door and you lay his hands on you when you're baptized, that mighty rushing wind just fills your soul and your mind. And you're filled with the Spirit of God. And you're seeing it played out through the story of the journey of the children of Israel in the Old and the New Testament. And again, he goes on to say, anyone who came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not hear them. Verse 9, he repeats again, I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved, and I will go in and out and find pasture. But the thief does not come except to steal and to kill and to destroy. I find it so amazing that so many times people inside the church, that someone will come in and then they want to change and steal and rob and bring in doctrines that are not biblical. And it's like, wow, how does that happen so quickly and easy? When God says, don't forsake the things that you've learned from the beginning. The middle of the week was the Wednesday, the middle of the 7,000 years, with the end of 4,000 years. Why was it the fourth? Why was it the fourth week that he began to introduce and give them bread? Is because it was the time predicted for the opening of the door. And that's what God wanted us to learn from Exodus 16. All right, let's go on a little bit further. The Sabbath is also the commandment on the fourth commandment. It is the doorway that separates you from the world. That's what God says. This is a sign between you and me, that you keep the Sabbath day. So when people say it doesn't matter what day you keep, maybe it don't matter to them, but it does to God. And if you're going to follow God, and if you're going to go in through the door, you're going to have to go through the one who opens and closes the door. That is Jesus Christ. And when is that? He says your beginning is your Sabbath day. Most of the people that this is the test commandment, they don't make it because they're afraid to go in that door because it's too hard on the other side of the door, because it changes your lives. If you're in a Protestant church, you can look at any Protestant church and say, well, I'm moving, so well, let me see what church is close to me, and you go to the next one, nothing in your life changes. You can go to another city, another state, it still doesn't change. But as soon as you keep the Sabbath day, your life has a sudden alteration. Why? Because the door has opened, the wind has rushed, and you're now in an environment that you've never been in before. And you're standing by the doorkeeper, which is Jesus Christ. When God first speaks to the Israelites in Exodus 16, verses 9 and 12, it was the Sabbath day. But God didn't tell them it was the Sabbath day. I found that strange. Why would he go through all of this? He does not. You go back and read it. He doesn't tell them it's the Sabbath. He doesn't introduce the Sabbath to 1 week later. So now, on the Sabbath day, he says, tonight, you're going to get meat. Tomorrow morning, which is the day after the Sabbath, you're going to have bread. And he says, you're going to go out and you're going to gather for 6 days. And on the 6th day, you're going to gather twice as much, because next week, I'm not going to give you any on a Saturday. Why? Because then he begins to introduce the Sabbath day, verse 20 through 25. The point is, God, this is important for you and I, God would not allow the Israelites to enter into his rest grumbling and complaining. Think about that. This is important for God's people. In other words, when you go to church on Saturdays, or you're entering his rest on Sabbath evening, remember this, because God would not give them his Sabbath rest while they were still in a rotten, bitter attitude, blaming God. He says they had to enter into his rest with reverence and awe. That's the same way with you and I. How do you prepare to go to church? And this is important. You know, a lot of people say, I don't even need to dress up. I'll just go in jeans and T-shirts. And I've been in churches that were wearing sandals and shorts when I go visit. And I wonder about that sometimes. And I know salvation is not dress. I understand that. But salvation is a state of mind. And it is a reverence toward God. When I look at what God made them do it in the Old Testament before they came to him, he said, you get ready for 3 days before you come and see me. 3 days almost every time before you come and see God to get yourself ready. You go out there and you get cleaned up. You get your clothes ready. You get this prepared. Then you come talk to me. God wasn't going to give him his Sabbath day. In other words, you are not going to make it into the kingdom any way you want to make it. Because it's a state of mind that God needs you to reverence him. When you sat down for services today, what was your frame of mind? And this is asking everybody who's going to get this tape, anywhere who gets this tape. What is your state of mind when you sat down for church? Do you have a state of reverence and awe before God when you sing those songs and do that opening prayer? Why I'm asking that? Because you're asking for the presence of God to be with you here today on the Sabbath day. That's important to God. And if you take that lightly, you're in trouble. Because God doesn't take it lightly. You look throughout the whole Bible and you'll find that. That doesn't mean that you have to wear a coat and tie every time you go anywhere, but you certainly better have your best and you better prepare. And your state of mind better be that to give reverence to God when you come here. All right, going on. That's a lesson here. I'm not making this, I'm just not here to threaten anybody. These are lessons that out of 16 that I'm bringing up. God desires the proper attitude to enter his rest. You're just not going to make it any way you want to go. If you don't have respect and you're not honoring the Sabbath day, you can forget it. You're not going to make it there. Exodus 16, verse 6 and 7 says, God tells us that there were 4 points to his plan of salvation to get us out of Egypt. Again, 4. Like a doorway. says, wherefore say to the children of Israel, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will rid you of their bondage, and I will redeem you with a stretched arm and with great judgments, and I will take to me for a people, and I will be to you a God, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God, which brings you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. That's the pledge of 4 points. That is a doorway that God says, I'm going to use to bring you to me. What does he do? Reiterate. 1, sanctification. He calls us out of this world, opens that door, and says, all right, come on in. He sanctifies you. That means sets you apart for a holy purpose. That's what it says. I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. 2, he promises deliverance. I will rid you of their bondage, he says. 3, he promises redemption. I will redeem you with a stretched arm. And 4, completion. I will take for you to me for a people. Now, I think that's the wrong chapter in Exodus I've got up here. I believe this is around Exodus 6. I could be wrong, but I know that's the wrong chapter in 16 verse 6 and 7. So if somebody finds that before we close, I get that corrected. I just want to make note of it. I know that's the wrong chapter, 16, because that's not in chapter 16 of Exodus. So anyway, but this is the 4 points of God's plan for opening the door for salvation for you and I. At Mount Sinai, God showed us where his intentions are to gather his people together. Galatians 3:24, he says, wherefore the law was our schoolmaster to bring us to Christ, that we may be justified by faith. So with Moses, he brought him out and he gave us the way to bring us to Christ. That's what the law was at Mount Sinai. And it is Christ who makes the way possible to complete the journey to the mount. If the Israelites didn't go out and partake of the bread of life, the manna every day, they would have died in the wilderness. In other words, God says this is the way. If you want to live, you got to go do as I tell you to do. And every day you got to go partake of the bread of life. And this is what he's saying. It's pointing to Jesus Christ. If you want to make it to the kingdom, every day you have to be out there partaking of Jesus Christ. You don't do that, you're not going to make it into the kingdom. John 6, verse 35. So Jesus said unto them, I am the bread of life. He that comes to me shall never hunger, and he that believes on me shall never thirst. It was an amazing story. Exodus 16, verse 4 now. And the Lord said to Moses, behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a certain quota every day, that I may test them whether they will walk in my law or not. Now, that's the same way that God does to you and I. God will grant you understanding, and he will wait to see whether you will walk in his law or not. So it's entirely up to you. If you walk in his law, he will take you to the next step of your journey. Step by step, piece by piece. Exodus 6. Not 16, it was Exodus 6. Okay, thank you, Bobby. So if y'all are looking at that chart, it's Exodus 6, not Exodus 16. Okay. So why does God give us so much detail in this? Do you see how much that little story, how much detail there is into it? It's an incredible amount of detail that God gives us. We know the story because it tells us in 1 Corinthians 10, verse 6. Now these things were for our examples to the intent that we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted. I would go back after you finish this sermon, or you go home, make a note. Go back and read the chapter, 1 Corinthians 10. And it walks through step by step what they did. And God says, I did this, I left it for you all for a reason, so that you all will not fall into the same problem that they did. I got one more final point to bring it to a close. When God began to introduce his Sabbath in the manner, the people were complaining and murmuring. They didn't like the way God was dealing with them. How about you? Some people say, well, I can't believe God's let me go through this. I don't understand why God isn't helping me here. I don't know why God's not answering my prayers. In other words, I just don't like what God's doing to me right now. Oh, nobody would do that, right? Yeah, people do that subconsciously without realizing it. I don't understand why God's letting this happen to me. And so you begin to wonder that, like, I'm better than this. That's what the children of Israel did. And so it was in the New Testament. When Jesus told them how they could attain eternal life, they murmured and they complained, and nearly everyone walked away from him. So I want to read a few verses out of John 6 for you. I don't want to read the whole thing because it's just too much here, but I want to make a point here before I leave. Attitude toward God is imperative that we understand how it can make or break you in God's plan. In John 6:32, Jesus says, "Most assuredly I say to you that Moses did not give you the bread from heaven," as we read earlier. "My Father gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to this word." 35. Jesus said to them, "I am the bread of life." That was it for a lot of them. How dare him complain that he came from heaven? All right, so that wasn't bad enough. He goes on, verse 41. Then Jesus complained about him because he said, "I am the bread of life that came down from heaven." What's amazing is that Jesus chose in Leviticus 16 the time when the children of Israel were murmuring, that in the New Testament he introduces himself as the bread of life. When? For the people who are murmuring. He goes to them again in the New Testament, just like in the Old Testament, and while they're murmuring with him, he says, "By the way, I'm the bread of life who came down from heaven," knowing it was going to set them off. I mean, they went ballistic with that. They couldn't stand it. Do you know, I talk to people who are asking about going to church, and I'll ask questions what they need to do, and they get ballistic with me. "I don't believe you need to do all of that. The law's been done away with." It's like, oh, here we go. I said, then do what you want to do, if that's what you believe. I said, but if you want to understand the truth, this is what God says. And they don't like it. So now the people don't like it. So he goes on. I'm going to pick up the story now, verse 53. All this grumbling is going on. Verse 53, Jesus said, "And most assuredly I say unto you," this steps it up even further, "unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you." They couldn't grasp that. It's to save your soul. "Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him up at the last day. For my flesh is food indeed, and my blood is drink indeed." He was the bread of life. They could not grasp what he was telling to them. "He who eats my flesh and drinks my blood abides in me, and I in him." Now, from that time on, he did that on purpose because, you see, he had to separate those who were going to follow him and who wasn't. Verse 60, "Therefore many of his disciples, when they heard this, said, 'This is a hard saying. Who can understand it?'" His own disciples. We don't know how many disciples he had, but no, at one time he sent out 70 of them. We knew he had the 12 apostles. We know that after Judas had hung himself in the book of Acts, there was at least two who was there from the beginning who saw it all. So there could have been at least 14 apostles at the time. So they had to pick between the two. And so we don't know how many were there, but even the apostles began to walk away. Eventually, for the time's sake, instead of me going through, he turns to the 12. He says, "Will you also walk away?" And of course, the story. Peter says, "Where are we going to go?" So here's what I'm going to close this out with you today. The children in Israel were on a journey to the mountain. At some point in time, they could not handle what they had to do or change. They took it out on God, they blamed him, and they walked away. They didn't make it. They would rather die, they said, or go back to Egypt than to go on. What's it going to take for you? What thing is going to upset you enough, like so many people in the church, like that's the last straw? If that's your God, I don't want nothing to do with him. Will you be like the disciples, or will you be like the 12? Where will you go? I was talking to a minister just the other night, and like he said, I don't understand how many 50, 70,000 people just turn around and went back in the world. You know, and I don't understand that either. I mean, it's just so hard to fathom that you spend your lifetime understanding the truth of that door that's been opened, the Spirit rushing in, the power of God working behind you, the understanding, all those things you've learned and seen and grown through over the years. And something got inside of you and say, I've had enough of this. And you take it out on God, because you can be mad at somebody else, but if you don't do what God says, you took it out on God. Blaming the man, but you took it out on God. And you walk away from salvation. That's what they did. Exodus 16 is a powerful story because it takes a person on the journey from grumbling to not understanding anything about it, feeding them, clothing them, giving them food, and giving them away to eternal life, and they squandered it away. And that's been the story of the Israelites to this very day. All right, so finishing up now. That account that we're talking about here in murmuring is in John 28 through verse 68. So when you get home, read 1 Corinthians 10 and read John 6. Put them together and think about what's going on. Now, I know when I said the point about dress and wearing coat and tie and wearing your best, I know that's going to upset people. I know that. I've sat in ministerial conferences where I have seen arguments of people saying, you don't have to dress up like that. That's a pagan symbol you wear around your neck. And they go on and on and on. What I'm saying here is, no, it's not about dress, but it's about bringing your best before God. If I didn't share that with you, I wouldn't be doing my job. In other words, if we can't gather our thoughts and our processes to bring God our very best, to give him the honor and respect that's due, then what are we doing? Do we really want to be there in the kingdom or not? Leviticus 16 shows us the start. 1 Corinthians shows us their finish. Where do you want to be? We're on our road today. We're in the midst of weeks, and we are on our journey to the mountain. God willing, we'll all make it.